Hi there, in my last video I looked at some of the main things that women tend to look for in a male partner and some of the deep evolutionary reasons why that's the case. This time I want to reverse the roles and look at some of the main things that men tend to look for in a female partner. So how this video is going to be structured is, first I want to introduce 3 core ideas or fundamental concepts that's very important when trying to understand the attraction in general, but later it will help us understand the individual traits or aspects of male attraction. After that, we're going to go into each of the evolutionary characteristics that helps form a female's mate value from the perspective of a male. So the first concept that I want to cover is that of the 2 mating strategies, and this is something that applies more predominantly towards men. From an evolutionary perspective, it's built into human nature to have both short-term and long-term mating strategies. But to understand why both of them exist and the difference between them, we need to look at a core underlying point, which is the cost of sexual encounters. So just for clarification, when I use the term the cost of sex, I'm referring specifically to the cost of making the wrong decision in your partner and that specific encounter. For men, the cost of having sex with the wrong partner is relatively low because there's no physical constraint tying them to the commitment of that particular child, whereas for women, this isn't the case. Women have to go through 9 months of pregnancy, and even after that child is born, typically they are one of the main people that child relies on in order to be able to survive and thrive. So the overall cost of sex for women is much higher, and this sexual asymmetry gives rise to a whole set of phenomena to compensate for this. Women have therefore evolved to become the choosier sex, and this is also true in the vast majority of cases throughout the animal kingdom. So if women are more choosy, then it typically shifts the emphasis towards the males to try and impress those women in order to form some kind of short or long-term partnership. In a way, across the animal kingdom, males typically exchange resources, time, energy, and commitment in exchange for mating opportunities. This therefore places importance on those particular resources, and men will typically only part way with those resources if they think the long-term benefits of doing so justify it. So this is why men more than women have developed those 2 mating strategies, both short-term and long-term, because it's often in the interests of men from an evolutionary perspective to accept any short-term invitations from a woman, whereas for women, the cost of doing this could be a lot higher if they make a mistake. There are some reasons though why men would want to invest in their partner, and one is that it increases the chances of survival for their children. Another is the trust and exclusivity you get from being in a relationship, because from a male perspective, you have no guarantee otherwise that the child is actually yours, but a woman doesn't actually have this problem. So the next concept I want to cover is the difference between proximate and ultimate explanations. I think a good way of explaining this is with an example, and that is the question of why people even have sex in the first place. The proximate explanation is because they're attracted to one another and they have a desire to do so, whereas the ultimate explanation is because it provides the opportunity to have children and continue on the human race. In fact, pretty much all emotions are proximate signals in order to be able to get you to do something for an underlying ultimate cause. So in summary, proximate explanations give you a short-term, in the moment, and often emotional driving force to do something, whereas ultimate explanations is the underlying reason that is often subconscious and unknown to you. And the last concept I want to cover is the difference between beauty and hotness, and when combined, they form overall romantic attraction. I think most people intuitively know the difference between someone who is beautiful and someone who is hot, although they're not always mutually exclusive. But what is interesting is that they send different signals, and hotness typically activates a man's short-term mating strategy, whereas beauty activates a man's long-term mating strategy. Hotness has a very potent but short-term effect on men, whereas beauty is much more of a slower burner, but is much more powerful in the long run, as it's the kind of thing that makes a guy want to dispense with his resources and commit to that particular person. The other difference is that hotness is typically limited to just physical appearance or looks, whereas beauty typically encompasses aspects of someone's personality too. An interesting side effect of all this is when it comes to intrasexual competition, and when a particular woman is trying to put a guy off from another woman, possibly because they're trying to get that guy interested in them themselves, they often use a tactic which is commonly called slut shaming. Women often make the mistake in assuming that because they typically go for commitment, that guys view things through the same lens. So when they try to put down another woman by saying that she often sleeps around or that she's not a very loyal partner, she assumes that will put the guy off, but actually it heavily depends on what that particular guy is looking for. As we'll get to later, infidelity for a guy who's looking for a stable, committed long-term relationship is one of the biggest turnoffs. But for a guy who's actually looking for something short-term, infidelity doesn't actually put that guy off. In fact, it could actually act as a form of enticement. Knowing that a particular woman tends to sleep around means that that guy is going to be less worried about her asking for resources or demanding some kind of committed situation. So overall, slut shaming is extremely effective at putting guys off when they're looking for something long term, but it actually has the opposite effect when they're looking for something short term. So now we're going to move on to the specific characteristics that men tend to gravitate towards in women. And some of these are going to be similar to the last video in things such as dependability, intelligence, kindness, and emotional stability, but there are some others that are specific to just men. One of these broader traits is fertility or reproductive capacity, and this is especially true when the guy is making a long-term commitment and willing to offset some of his resources in order to stabilize the particular partnership and the potential children that they may have. In some species of animals, they give off strong, often visual signals of fertility, but in humans, this has to be inferred in other ways. The first of these ways is youth, and this is why men typically are attracted to women who are younger than them. As a woman approaches her 40s, her reproductive capacity tends to drop more significantly, and as she approaches 50, it drops close to zero. So going back to proximate and ultimate explanations, the ultimate reason why men tend to gravitate towards younger women is that it correlates with their chances of fertility, whereas the proximate explanation is that they find them more attractive. Now I should point out that this is especially true for hotness, but to some extent beauty tends to defy age, and that's partly because it gives off different signals, but also because it encompasses aspects of personality instead. Beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, and it's true that we all have different preferences, but the minds behind those eyes are shaped by millions of years of evolution. So even though women vary a lot in terms of physical appearance, there are some traits that are seen as universally attractive to men. The first one is body shape, and this has some interesting subtleties. Firstly, studies have shown that women overestimate the importance that they think their male partners place in them being thin, skinny, or low body fat. But the studies show very clearly that cross-culturally men care a lot less about body fat and skinniness and more about where that fat actually is stored, and that gives rise to the certain body shape, typically in the form of the hourglass. It's been shown now that fat or weight matters a lot less to guys than women think, but what does seem to matter is waist to hip ratio. Another interesting subtlety to all this is that there is some cultural variation to the amount of body fat that is typically deemed as being attractive to that particular culture. So with people who come from cultures where resources were a lot more scarce, then body fat is actually seen as a lot more attractive because it's a sign of wealth or status. Whereas in cultures where resources are more abundant, then body fat tends to be less desirable overall. Another aspect which is contained within physical looks is symmetry, and this typically applies to having a symmetrical face. A study was done where people were asked to evaluate or rate the overall attractiveness of computer-generated faces. These computer-generated faces were created by combining lots of actual photos together to kind of get the average face shape across all of those particular photos. It turns out that the more photos that were used, the more attractive that those faces were rated, because the asymmetries across one face will be ironed out by the combination of lots of other photos. Further proof that men value physical appearance more than women is in a study of 5,000 college students, and they were asked what kind of traits and characteristics do they want in their future partner, and men listed variations of physical attractiveness far more than women did. And the last trait where there seems to be some sexual asymmetry is with fidelity and chastity. In one of those cross-cultural studies that I mentioned in the last video, in no culture did women value chastity more than men did. Other studies have shown too that modern men put a premium on fidelity, and I think a big reason for that is because men can't guarantee that the child is theirs in the same way that a woman can. An interesting consequence of all this is when you look at sexual jealousy. And even though both men and women can experience sexual jealousy in the same magnitudes and the same frequencies, they're often perceived in different ways. When it comes to cheating, men get a lot more uncomfortable, hurt, anxious and jealous at the specific act of sexual infidelity, whereas women get the corresponding and equivalent sensations at the emotional investment from their partner towards someone else. This is likely because a woman perceives a guy who's getting emotionally invested in someone else as a sign that they're going to deviate their resources, their time, their energy and commitment towards someone else in the long term. The proximal causes of all this is the same in both sexes, in that they experience a whole range of negative emotions, but the ultimate cause for a guy is the fact that he no longer is able to determine whether any future child is actually his. So the main reason I made this video is not to make anyone feel insecure or self-conscious or reduce human behaviour down to such primal instincts, but rather it's to help us understand some of the deep mechanisms that drive so much of modern behaviour, and if we're better able to understand this, we're able to mitigate a lot of the negatives and drive up a lot of the productive behaviours that allow us to survive and thrive and prosper in the modern world too. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like, subscribe or leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.